So Masora is, I guess, tradition is the closest translation, but it's a concept that is used to describe the process of the oral Torah. The Torah, it's not just, when you say tradition in English, it means like, oh, something that, can you pass one down to Ravid? Ravid, you got one? Does it look like a menorah to you? Maybe I should have invested a little more in the graphics. There are 7. 7 is good, and I blackened out the middle one. It is in some ways, in many ways, the foundational time period for the Jewish Masorah, the tradition. Again, tradition sounds like it's just folklore. The way it's used in our context is that it's the oral Torah, essentially, the Judaism as we know it. Many people call it rabbinic Judaism beforehand. They call it prophetic Judaism, but we try not to make a divide, and we do believe that there's a continuum all the way through the generations. But there's no question that the foundational, the changes, the way that Judaism looks like nowadays is based on the time period at the Second Temple and beyond. So let's just look at the top line. Boker Tov, Michal. There's a page for you. And thanks to a friend Aaron with the machine, it might even stay. If you like, you can sort of make it prettier. Like you can draw on it because it's erasable. You can make marks if you like. If anybody wants some markers, you can make it a little more colorful. The menorah. You have to sort of imagine it. But in my mind, I can imagine it here. So let's start at the beginning. Types of Torah literature. Torah Nevim Ktuvim. What does that stand for? The first row. Tanakh, right. Ketuvim is correct. Why is it ketuvim, not chetuvim? I taught you the principle that when you have the letters beged, kefet, any one of those 6 letters, at the beginning of the word, it gets the dagesh, it gets the dot in it. So, if it's part of an acronym, if it's in the middle of a word, it's a chaf. So we say Tanakh, although when you say each word separately, it becomes not chetuvim but ketuvim. The chaf gets the dagesh. Torah Nevim Ktuvim, which means, what's another word for Torah? I didn't put in the English because everybody seems to know that. But what do we call the Torah? You could say that this whole thing is Torah. Yeah. All of Jewish tradition is Torah, but we use Torah also in particular for what's in the Sefer Torah, in the scroll. Another word for it is Chumash, which means 5. Very good, from the word Chamesh. And therefore, it's translated many times as the Pentateuch. What's the Pentagon in America? Yeah. The Pentagon? Yeah. 5 sides. 5 sides. The Pentagon. So Pentateuch. Yeah. I don't know what Tuk means. I don't know, but apparently it's some kind of a book or tradition. But it has 5. That's the classic division. The Chumash, but I wrote in Torah instead of Chumash because only that way do you get the acronym Tanakh. If you use, it would be Chanach. Chanach, where nobody would know what I'm talking about. But Torah, of course, can be used for, in general. At the beginning, I wrote the menorah map of Torah tradition. But that would be confusing more. I wrote teaching you a new word, Mesorah. So Torah Nevim Ketuvim, that's the written law, and then we have the oral law starting to get written down in the Talmud. The Talmud consists of essentially 3 parts. The only books that really came before the Talmud was composed is the Midrash and the Mishnah. Gemara has discussions about the Mishnah written around the Mishnah, but for all intents and purposes, the Talmud is the book of Judaism from then on. And then there's 3 other types. Here, I'm glad I put it first, on the first line. Why? Responsa, law codes, and commentaries, they're not necessarily in that order. It's true that in the first period after the Talmud, there were very little books of law codes written. Pretty much the great rabbis knew what they knew, and they didn't put it in books. That was only when people didn't know. And people started to ask them, so it really started with responsa, but very quickly, in the period of the Rishonim, as you can see, I guess that's period 6, and of course 7, you have more and more law codes and more commentaries. There are some that started at the end of the period of the Geonim. And you can see what I'm referring to when you look at line 3 or 4. You see the Geonim, Rishonim, and Achronim. You see those words I've been using? You have to be able to be conversant about our Jewish Mesorah, our tradition. To be conversant, you have to know this pretty much off by heart. You have to know this off by heart, pretty much. You have to be able to... B'ezrat Hashem, next week I'll give you a blank page like this, and you'll fill it in yourselves. No joke. Seriously, this is not... How many boxes are there to fill in here? 7 times 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 28. 28 words. You know them all, mostly. You should be able to fill in 28 words. And you have those who are graphically inclined can even use the structure to memorize it.
When next week?
Sunday, B'ezrat Hashem. You have all Shabbat to memorize this. Okay? Yes, questions.
I don't understand the structure so good. Because
Okay.
I see here with Torah, I see forefathers, judges, and then I see I've watched of him, but it's the same.
So,
I don't understand it.
yeah. Those 2 lines are translations. Yeah.
Because of you think, hey, Shoftim there from the time of the Nevi'im came the book of Shoftim.
Very good. So the question is, how do you divide between period 1 and period 2? Roughly, we have 500 years each, right?
Okay.
So minus 1,000 begins period 2 already. And the truth is, the narrative books, some people refer not to the 5 books of Moses, but to the 6. 6 or even 7. Because Yoshua and Shoftim pretty much continue the narrative from the 5 books of Moses. And then, of course, Yoshua was Moses' student who led the conquest into the land of Israel. Shoftim is how the Jewish people lived in Israel afterwards for a few hundred years until the advent of the kingdom, the kings and the prophets. Listen, the forefathers were also prophets. Our Torah tells us that they spoke to God. That's what defines a prophet. But I wanted to, most commonly, right, like in number 2, period number 2 at the top, the body of literature that's referred to as Nevi'im refers to First Temple times, from Shmuel and all the prophets that spoke during the time of the kings of Judah and Israel, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, pretty much it's all First Temple period. And so I wanted to leave the Nevi'im for period 2. And so the other names for the leadership that are common, we have the Avot, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Moshe gets thrown in there, and the Shoftim as well. בוקר טוב. שלום. חננאל עוד לא פה. Sorry.
So
Yeah.
I see like, okay, so they did from the time of the Avot till the stability of the Malchut, till
Exactly.
the kingdom.
Till the
So
kingdom
they
starts.
include
Exactly.
Gideon, everyone.
Includes Shoftim. All the Gideon was one of the Shoftim. Right. Includes everything until King David, pretty much. Till King David. King Saul and King David. The kings. Right? That's already period 2. It's approximately 500 years. We don't know exactly when the Exodus was. It's a big debate. But somehow we do pretty much have an idea of when King David was, and it's pretty much near year 1000 minus 900, whatever it is. Okay, other questions? So let's keep going in that line. We have the Avot and the Shoftim. This is just translation English and Hebrew for the same thing, but maybe I should even have taken out the line to make it clear that this is just a translation. The kings and the prophets, Melachim and Nevi'im, priests and scribes, Kohanim and Sofrim. Okay, and the Kohanim and Sofrim, who was the most famous Sofer?
Shimshon. Oh, Sofer.
Sofer. Ezra Sofer, right. And what period are we talking about? We're talking about, as you can see underneath, the Second Temple period. And the Hasmonean era is that the Hasmonean kings were at the end of this, towards the end of the Second Temple. We talked about it on Hanukkah. Then, when we get to the next period, we call Chazal, Chachamim, Zichronam Livracha. That's why Chachamim becomes Chazal. Zal stands for Zichronam Livracha. May their memories be for a blessing. There's 2 fancy names for the authors of the Mishnah and the authors versus the authors of the Gemara. Tanaim versus Amoraim. Does everybody get that?
Yes.
Pinchas, who were the Tanaim? Tanaim. That's the name we use for the authors of the Mishnah. It has the same word, actually. When you look at it, and let me erase this so you don't get confused. The word Mishnah, I guess I'll do it in Hebrew as well, right? In Aramaic and in ancient Hebrew also, the shin many times switches out with the taf. So if you have the word shor, which means an ox, in Aramaic, it's tor. The taf and the shin switch. So when you have Mishnah, it's not surprising to say that you're going to have Atana. Atana is like Shana, someone who repeats. So the Tanaim is just the plural of that, but it's from the same word. The Mishnah is a book which was repeated. The word Lishnot, Shana, means, we all know Shana Tova, means a good year. It means year. Why is a year called a year? Because the cycle keeps getting repeated year after year. So this book is called the repeated one. Mishnah gets repeated. These were oral teachings that finally got written down, and they called the entire book the 6 orders of the Mishnah, 6 categories of the oral law. And it was the Mishnah, those authors who are mentioned in the Mishnah, all those rabbis, all those Chachamim, Chazal, some of them get the moniker, the title, Tanaim. Why? Because they are from year 0 to 200. The first 200 years, until the Mishnah was closed, anybody who teaches in that time period is called a Tana. Tana is singular, Tanaim, plural. After that, from 200 to 500, really it's till 700. It extends a little longer. I'm being imprecise here. That's the period where we have the Gemara. Gemara is the discussions on the Mishnah. But there's a very clear divide between once the Mishnah was sealed, the next period, the next hundreds of years, all the rabbis accepted upon themselves, we will not contradict the earlier rabbis, the Tanaim. We don't have the authority. We are going to discuss it. We're called, those people who lived in this time period, Moraim. Right? Amorah, as you can see, Amorah, it has the same words as Gemara. Gemara and Amorah. So the Amoraim are those people who are the authors and the people who are discussing the Mishnah. So because this is such an important development stage of Judaism, we have Mishnah, and we have Gemara, and we have special names. Tanaim. Tanaim. And Moraim. Moraim versus Tanaim. Is that clear? Is that clear? Yeah.
Question, so the Rabbi explained that the T is interchangeable with the Shin.
Yes.
That's why the reason why a lot of Ashkenazis say the Shin instead of the Taf, and they say Emet, Emes.
Nah, I don't think so. I don't think so. There's other reasons for that, but we'll leave that aside. But what you do find it is that appears until today. When you want to go to a movie and it's 3D, or when you ride a bike and you're a little child and you have a tricycle. You know what it's called in Hebrew? Telat ofan, or telat meimad. Telat instead of shalosh. The taf and the shin switch. Instead of shalosh, taf lamed. Taf instead of shin lamed shin. Till today, the shin and the taf switch in many instances, especially these, there's a few examples. But so Mishnah and Tana, it's the same word essentially, okay?
If I look here in the same
column
like the sages,
yes,
Sephardim and Ashkenazim, but the column next to it in 5
yeah,
was first Sidurim, right?
Sidurim,
But
yes.
if I'm not mistaken, the first Sidurim was in Babylonia and Israel, not Sephardim and Ashkenazim.
True. The Sephardim and Ashkenazim began to be scattered in this period. The Romans pretty much scattered the Jewish people everywhere. But it's hard to define. Like I wrote the Crusades, the expulsions and the massacres in 5, 6, and 7. You see that? What happened to the Jewish people? They happened throughout. There were expulsions earlier, and there were expulsions later. And the Sephardim and Ashkenazim began to be separate communities during the Roman Empire. So it's a little imprecise. I agree with you. The Sidurim and the different wordings of the prayers, the nusachim of the tefillot, we have very little changes from this era. It's more from later eras. But Sephardim and Ashkenazim is not only about the wording of the prayers. Sfarad means Spain. Ashkenaz means Germany. It just means that they're just communities in different places. It's not referring to the Sidur. The Sephardim and Ashkenazim, you read it and you say, Sidurim. No. It just refers to communities in different countries. Diaspora. Diaspora is a fancy word for dispersing of the communities. Okay? Okay. What else? Okay, so Pinchas, you see what Tanaim are? Tanaim. You find them on the page in the middle?
Okay.
Names of rabbis in the period of the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva is a Tana. That's right. Rabbi Akiva is a Tana. Right. Good.
Can you say that Hillel and Shammai were they Tana or they were before that?
Good question. Good question. They were the earliest of the Tanaim. They came even before the first generation. Usually we refer to them as the last of the pairs. That's one thing I didn't put in here, is that there was a series of 8 pairs of rabbis who gave over the Masorah, the Jewish tradition, even before the Tannaitic era began. So traditionally we start the Tannaitic era with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was a student of Hillel. So Hillel and Shammai are a little bit before the Tanaim. We still call them Chazal though. So
Sometimes in my mind I see it like you have the Tanaim, and then you have people like Hillel. They are like the actors in the talk they've been speaking about in the Mishnah, but they didn't.
there are many statements of Hillel and Shammai in the Mishnah. More, what you find is statements of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit means Beit, house, meaning house. What is it? School, house of study. The tradition from Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai are pretty much before the Mishnaic era, and the Mishnah is full of their statements, but more statements that came from their school, from their teachings. Okay. What else? Yeah, Aaron.
What was the difference between Tanaim and Amoraim, except for that one wrote Mishnah, the other wrote Gemara? I think someone mentioned to me maybe the first could perform miracles and the second not.
I don't think so. I mean, there's actually stories of miracles performed by both. It's interesting. It's very hard to understand this big divide, this line that I wrote here, big line between what happened at year 200 that was so significant. The only thing we can point to really is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Yehuda, Judah the Prince, as he's known, and the writing of the Mishnah. It was such a major event in Jewish history. It's really the first new book since the Bible. Right? The Mishnah was written in year 200. In year 200. And the rabbis afterwards decided that nobody has the right to disagree with a Tana. It's like a new period. And they had so much respect, and more than respect, they felt that they don't have the same authority as the Tanaim. So it's a real break in the level of authority. Now for us, 2,000 years later, we're looking at it. Of course, we have tremendous understanding of the authority of the Amoraim as well. But the Amoraim were very careful about the authority of the Tanaim as a separate stage. Of course, as I said, we look at it as one period of Chazal. But the Tanaim somehow achieved a level, a status to the later generations, which became, it's almost like the foundational building blocks are the words of the Tanaim, and everything afterwards has to be built on top of that foundations. You cannot, dig your own foundations afterwards. The Amoraim always have to find a foundation within the words of the Tanaim for their statements. Is that clear? It's like building a second level on top of the... If you're building a house, building a building, I like to tell the story. Come on in, Josh. There's this chair here for you. There's even a page for you. I'd like to tell the story of a king a king who wants to give a gift to his children, his two sons, and one of the sons, the king loves him very much, and he says to him, go ahead and choose. I give you 4 poles, and you can stake out any part of my kingdom to be yours, giving it to you. Wow. So the son takes the 4 poles, and he says, well, great. He goes to the best area of the kingdom, and he puts down 1 pole on this side, and the other pole, as far as he can walk, where he thinks that it's a good place, puts down the other pole. And then with the other 2 poles, he starts walking forward. He realizes, wow, I can have as much as I want, right? So the more you go, the more, till you put down those other 2 poles, you don't have your you don't have your perimeter. So he keeps walking, because he wants more and more and more. And to tell you the truth, that's the last we heard of him. He kept on going, because he always thought, well, I can get a little more if I keep going a little more, keep going a little more. I keep going a little more. At the end of the story, he never got anything, because he never completed the process. So every time you want to get something, the smarter son chose his borders, and he laid foundations there for a palace, and then he built on top of the foundations, he built a beautiful building and gardens and a swimming pool, everything you can imagine that you would ever need as a place to be. So this is the secret called tzimtzum. You might have heard of that before. It's a Kabbalistic word. Tzimtzum means constriction. Constriction. God, in order to create the world, God is way beyond us and way beyond this little small earth. Even He's way beyond the entire cosmos and all the galaxies. God is infinite. So what does He need us? What does He care? Why does He create the world? It's called, therefore, tzimtzum. God constricted Himself. Part of every creative process is a constriction. And so we can describe every creative process. Here we're talking about the Jewish Masorah, the Jewish tradition. In some ways you can say there's a constriction. Here's one example of the constriction. The Amoraim limited their authority and says, we are going to build on top of the foundation laid by the Tanaim, by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and all the Tanaim who came before him. And none of us are going to build outside of the foundations laid by the Tanaim and all of their commentaries of the Torah. You could say that the Tanaim also constricted themselves. Because it says we're not going to make up stuff about Judaism. We're going to base ourselves based on the Tanakh and the oral traditions which were passed down. So we have another further constriction and a further constriction. But ultimately, that constriction, that limitation, gives you the only way to build. You can't build a structure if you don't lay the foundations, if you don't decide what's the boundaries of your kingdom, you'll never be able to develop the kingdom. And who knows if we'll ever find you again. There's lots of ideas out there in the world, lots of philosophical principles, there's lots of legal ideas. There's lots, but if you want to have a tradition that can develop, you have to have its borders. And this is the process we're describing. Yeah, Pinchas, you wanted to ask something?
Amorai,
Amora, from the word Gemara. The word Gemara, which means to speak.
Yerushalayim or the Babylon?
Both.
Huh?
Both.
Both.
Yes.
Oh.
There were Amoraim in the land of Israel and in the land of Bavel. And there's actually 2 Talmuds.
Oh.
Talmud from the land of Israel. Sometimes it's called the Jerusalem Talmud. Sometimes it's called the Palestinian Talmud.
The Babylon.
And the Talmud Bavli is from Bavel, right from Babylon. There's 2 Talmuds because there were groups of Amoraim discussing the Mishnah, both in the land of Israel and in Bavel. Yeah.
The Gemara means to speak, but can you also say to teach?
Yes. You could also say about Mishnah, it means to teach. Shana, to teach, it really comes from anything that you repeat. You could say about teach, and everything that you speak or instruct. Gemara, many times we use, there's a phrase in the Talmud, Shanu Chachamim, from the word of Mishnah. And then sometimes it says, Shanu, Rabbanan is another word for the rabbis, right? Tanu Rabbanan, Shanu Chachamim. And what do we usually translate it when we're studying Gemara? We say, the rabbis taught. We don't go into the origin of the word is Mishnah, which means to repeat. It's a teaching. Everything, right now I'm giving you a teaching. But what's unique about these words, the word Mishnah and Tana, they're associated only and solely dedicated to this time period, the foundational period of the Mishnah. From year 0 to year 200, you could go a few years before that, but pretty much this foundational period is considered like the DNA, right? Every cell has within it DNA. DNA is the beginning of the DNA of Judaism. Many people would say, oh, it's the Tanakh. It's not wrong, but there's another stage of development which becomes, it's much more explicit. It's almost like the Tanakh is like the zeros and ones of binary. And then but the code is actually written in Chazal speak, in Tanaitic Hebrew. So this is the DNA of Judaism, is in that. And then the Amoraim, their explanations are also very important because the Talmud got spread to the diaspora, to all over. The Talmud got spread to all over the diaspora. The Jewish people, wherever they were, they accepted the Talmud, which means they accepted the underlying assumptions of the Talmud. What's the primary underlying assumption of the Talmud? That the Tanaim are giving us the oral Torah, and we can't argue against, or we can't reject the words of the Tanaim. We can interpret them, we can develop them, and that's what the Amoraim do. And so essentially, what became accepted after year 500, the end of period 4, from 5, 6, and 7 on, till this day, what we call Judaism is all based on the Talmud. The interpretations of the rabbis, the discussions of the rabbis, of this DNA. The DNA starts with the Tanakh and the oral traditions, which are recorded by the Tanaim in the first 200 years of the millennia, of the previous millennia. Okay, from year 0 to 200. So that's really important. If you ever want to study Gemara, if you ever want to understand further Judaism, this understanding this foundational period here of the Tanaim and how it's the DNA of Judaism, this is central stuff. Okay, question. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't understand one thing. Why I heard the Jerusalem Talmud was finished in the city of Tiberias,
Okay.
and at that time the city of Jerusalem was already destroyed, as far as and the Amoraim are not, probably not from Jerusalem. So why the Talmud is called the Jerusalem Talmud instead of
Shalom.
Tiberias Talmud or?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I think that for the majority of the period of 200 to 500, that's when the Jerusalem Talmud was sealed. The majority of the period, the center was Jerusalem. Even though towards the end, Jerusalem was already destroyed, sometimes it's called the Talmud of the land of Israel because it's a little imprecise. You're correct. It wasn't only in Jerusalem that they were studying and discussing the words of the Tanim. It was throughout the land of Israel for hundreds of years. So maybe the better term to use is the Talmud of the land of Israel. But it became also known as Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. Yerushalayim, of course, is the center of the land of Israel. Even if it gets destroyed at some point forever, Jerusalem is the center of the land of Israel. So it's true that there were different centers of rabbinic study during that period.
But Jerusalem was no longer the religious center at that time.
Not the religious center, it was the commercial center. Maybe that's why. There were different periods. These are very broad brushstrokes of Jewish history, yeah.
Quick question. Maybe I'm assuming, but why is it seems to me that the Talmud Bavli is more studied than the Talmud Yerushalayim.
Yes, it is. Why is that? It's a good question. It's because, for a few reasons. Number one, those extra 200 years that the Gemara continued to be discussed and written until it was sealed in Bavel. So in Bavel, they continued the discussions after the center in Israel was already not viable. The Romans were too harsh in the land of Israel for there to have the space to do the scholarship. So that's one reason, is that there was an extra few hundred years of development in Bavel. And so the more you work on it, the more it gets developed. And secondly, I guess it's pretty much saying the same thing. Babylon became the center of authority. That's where afterwards, what's the next period? Who are the leaders? The Geonim. Here I call them Babylonian rabbis. They weren't called necessarily rabbis, but just to make it understandable for us. During the period of the Geonim, they were in Bavel. And the Talmud, when it started to be spread among the diaspora, among all the Jews who were scattered everywhere, they had questions about the Talmud, about how do we practice our Judaism based on the Talmud. Who would they ask? The Geonim were Babylonian rabbis. And so the Babylonian Talmud became much more central to the teachings, although we study both, of course. And some halachot only appear in the Talmud Yerushalmi and not in the Talmud Bavli. We practice them. They're both of the Talmudim. The point of the authority is from the era of Chazal. The Mishnah period and the Gemara period, and the Chazal, the rabbis who taught, who developed, who explained and fleshed out the Jewish tradition for us. So they're both authoritative. But sometimes there are debates, there are differences, sure.
Height of style of writing?
More than style of writing. There's actually head-to-head debates. Sometimes the Babylonian Talmud says it's permitted, and the Jerusalem Talmud says it's forbidden. Sometimes the opposite. Usually in those cases we follow the Babylonian Talmud. It's considered to be more authoritative because of the extra few hundred years and the development of it being accepted as the authority. There's one other factor that I'll add in to answer your question, with your permission. Is this okay? It's interesting to you? It's good stuff?
Yes.
The other factor I want to add in is that there's another group of rabbis which are not on your page. If you want, you can write them in. These are yours. This is a gift. You can do anything you want to it. I just want it to be preserved. So I asked Aaron to, please pass this down to Hananel.
Why Amorai can compose the both Talmud, Jerusalem and Babylon? Why?
That's what they did. Why did they? Because the other
different the Machon, the book, Machon.
Right. Well, we're studying Torah in Jerusalem. There's a yeshiva in New York, and they're studying Torah there. It's the same Torah. We have to have discussions sometimes. But wherever the Jews were, they learned Torah, they developed Judaism, both in the land of Israel and in Bavel. I'm not sure I understand your question.
200 years ago, this
Group of rabbis.
Verify position.
Very what?
Five away. Five from Babylon, five from Israel.
Far. They're far away. They were far away, okay. But there were some rabbis who went back and forth. And there's a group of rabbis that are called the Nechutai, people who went back and forth, and they brought teachings from the Babylonian academies to the Israel academies, and back and forth. So there were discussions. But in both places, there were very high-level scholars. Aaron mentioned that there's even miracles mentioned. These Chazal, these rabbis, these Chachamim, were at a very, very high level of spirituality and intellect. We treat their words with the utmost respect and authority because we treat them as the DNA of Judaism. You understand what I'm saying? I wanted to complete what I was saying to Michael. There's another group of rabbis which is not on your page. I'll write it on the board if you want to write it in yourselves. They're called the Savoraim. Again, the im is the plural. Savoraim in Hebrew. Savoraim. Now what they did, they're in between the period of the Amoraim and the Geonim. Everybody see where the Amoraim are? And the Geonim. What did they do? So we're talking about here, year 700 to 800 approximately. This is where we have the Savoraim. What did they do? They were editors of the Talmud. The Gemara. They edited the Gemara. The Savoraim made the Talmud Bavli more readable. They only edited the Babylonian Talmud. They were in Bavel. They were the predecessors of the Gaonim. Some of them were Gaonim. The Savoraim, that editing job made the Talmud from Babylon much more readable, much more understandable, much more, therefore it became more authoritative. There's a third reason for you, Michael, why the Babylonian Talmud is considered to be more authoritative than the Yerushalmi, than the Palestinian Talmud. It's not because we don't like the Palestinians. They have nothing to do with this, the modern day Palestinians. They're just anti-Semites, grouped together to try to keep us away from the land of Israel. They have nothing to do with the ancient world that we're discussing now from 2,000 years ago. Apparently somebody published a book, 1,000 pages of Palestinian history. You can buy it on Amazon. it's empty. There's nothing here. There's nothing in there. It
Blanco.
doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. It's just a funny word that they used. Palestine actually is the word that the Romans decided to give to the land of Israel when they tried to right, and they tried to ignore the Jewish presence in the land and try to erase the Jewish presence in the land. They called it Palestine, but it had nothing to do with Jews or Arabs or anything like that. It was just a Roman, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's a Roman name, Palestine. But we use it. That's like, until the state of Israel was created. You all know the newspaper called the Jerusalem Post? It's run by Jews, right? It's a Jewish newspaper. Used to be called the Palestine Post. The Jews called it the Palestine Post. All the Jews living in the land of Israel were called Palestinians. That was just the name of the country, of the area, not the country. There was no country called Palestine. The area was geographically called Palestine by the Romans 2,000 years ago. It has nothing to do with the modern day group of Arabs who decided to call themselves Palestinians and claim that they want to have a country in their name. There never was such a country of Arabs called Palestine. Anyways, I digress. So, Michal, you have a full answer to your question. Why the Talmud Bavli has more import or more gravity than the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael. Yeah. You have a question, Benjamin? Benjamin, another question? Josh, you have a question? You're good? You're just stretching? Okay.
Outside.
Yeah.
We have Gem, Amo, Mish, Savo. Savo is from my knowledge.
Yeah. Svara, the word svara means rational thought, right? So I don't know exactly why they use this term because they're mainly editors. They added in keywords and guiding words, some punctuation. The savoraim, I don't know why they're called that. Savara means logic. I guess they use their logic to do that editing, but it's not. Don't really know why they're called savoraim.
Savor is knowledge.
Ah, yes, savant, to be smart, yes. They were smart, no question about it. Reason. Yeah, so they used their reason to edit the Gemara. That's the main function. But I didn't put them on here because they're not wasn't a very long period, and they did a very big service. So I hope they forgive me from not putting them on the chart. I'm trying to keep it basic, 500 years each period. Okay, next. What do you see? Anything more further?
Okay, we see the Rishonim now.
Okay. The Rishonim.
The lawmakers.
And the commentaries. They both started pretty much in parallel. In section 6 and 7, we have both types of scholarship. Really, all three types of literature. 5, 6, and 7. You see those three types of literature? 5, 6, and 7 from the top of the page? Till today, some people would decide to write a Torah book. They write a book of responsa. Some rabbis will answer questions. Some rabbis will write a law code. Some rabbis will write a commentary on one of the previous books. These are the three major categories of books that we have until today, after the Talmud. We have commentaries on the commentaries. And then we have law codes which summarize previous law codes. And responsa, every time one of you asks me a question, a new responsa is born. Right? If I write them down, usually we're talking about literature, so it has to be written down. But nowadays, where do we write? WhatsApp. There's a book recently published. Responsa of SMS. That's what the title of the book. It's a collection. This rabbi kept getting instant messages on his phone from students all around the country, and he wrote up the answers, all very short, of course, 'cause that's the medium. It's a new phenomenon. We never used to have responsa of one-liners, but now we do. It's a sign of the times.
The book of responsibility in the second floor.
There is not one book. There are hundreds and thousands of books of responsa from every era, the period of the Gaonim, the period of the Rishonim, and the period of the Achronim until today. There's responsa from every era. You might have heard of Rav Moshe Feinstein, right? His book of responsa is his primary book. It's called Igrot Moshe, the Letters of Moshe. It's responsa. He never wrote a code. He never wrote a commentary. There's another book that he wrote, actually, which is full of his commentaries. But his most famous book is his book of responsa. Another rabbi, Rav Yosef Karo, you might have heard of him. He wrote a commentary and a law code, and so on and so forth. There are till today hundreds and hundreds of volumes of responsa, and many different law codes. Of course, law codes. Some of them get more popular, some of them get less popular. Also commentaries. Anybody could write a commentary, but it depends on who reads it. Depends on there's a statement in the Talmud that says, "Hakol talui b'mazal, afilu sefer Torah shebahichal." Everything depends on luck, to some measure. Even the books in the Beit Midrash, the books that get popular, the books that get less popular. It's hard to know when you publish a book which one's going to be the bestseller. You never know. You try your best, and some people's their writings became very, very popular. Some people they didn't. Other commentaries they didn't. It's very hard to know which one's going to succeed.
I'm impressed. You're going there. Deep, deep, deep. I never thought that you.
Okay, I don't know what you mean exactly, but
Well, I'm impressed with the level of your knowledge.
oh well, thank you. I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you.
Because
The point is to be able to teach you this menorah, this map of the Jewish tradition, the Jewish Masorah. Because otherwise, it's just a bunch of books in a library. You don't know who's who. You don't know how the development continues. But I do want to conclude our discussion on the map for today. Of course, we did discuss a little bit more the historical periods. We were talking about Hanukkah. When was Hanukkah?
In the second temple period, in Greece.
In the Greek period. Good, very good. Right. And who destroyed the first temple?
The Babylonians.
Right, Nebuchadnezzar. And who exiled the 10 tribes?
King from Assyria.
Assyria, Sancherib, the king of Assyria. Very good. It was Assyrian general. And when did the Jewish people leave Egypt?
In somewhere 1500.
Somewhere in that period.
210 years after they arrived.
Very good. That's right. That's right. Yafé מאוד. Yafé מאוד. All right. Anyways, that's a gift for you. Let's learn a zemer, because today is Friday. Today is Friday. Ravid missed out so many days, but I'm glad that you're feeling well enough to be with us now. I think I need to stop talking very soon. Over Shabbat, I'm just going to try to be silent so that my throat gets better. I like to teach every Friday a song. Every Chamishi, that's right, every Thursday. I apologize. And we'll do maybe a short one. Or should we do one? Let's see. One minute, so I'll tell you where. Okay, I think I know what I want to teach you this time. You might have heard this before. Please turn to page 1 second. Page 67. Page 66 and 67. We're not going to learn the whole Zemer called Tzur Mishelo. That's what it starts at the beginning of the page. You might know it. But on page 67, 66 and 67, the numbers are very hard to see. I want to teach you the last stanza on page 66 and 67. Yibaneh HaMikdash. The last stanza. Yibaneh HaMikdash. May the temple be on the right hand side. It goes from right to left. Yibaneh HaMikdash Ir Tzion Temaleh. What does that mean? May the temple be rebuilt, Zion's city full again. We will sing a new song as we go up in joy. Okay, some people sing just those words out of the entire Zemer. You might have heard it before. Yibaneh, Yibaneh, Yibaneh HaMikdash, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion Temaleh. Again, Yibaneh, Yibaneh, Yibaneh HaMikdash, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion Temaleh. You got it? It's very simple. La 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 la. Again, la 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 la. Now we'll do it slowly with the words again. Yibaneh, Yibaneh, Yibaneh HaMikdash, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion Temaleh. Again. Yibaneh, Yibaneh, Yibaneh HaMikdash, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion Temaleh. Ready for the high part now? Ready? Veshamna shir, shir chadash, uvirna na aleh. ושמנה שיר שיר חדש וברננה נעלה. You know this. We'll do it again. ושמנה שיר שיר חדש וברננה נעלה. ושמנה שיר שיר חדש Over na na na. May the temple be rebuilt, Zion city full again. There we will sing a new song as we go up in joy. Na'aleh, la'alot, aliyah. Who made aliyah here? Who made aliyah? Ravid, Binyamin, Pinchas. You made aliyah, but not yet to the Beit HaMikdash. We're talking about Yibaneh HaMikdash. And then Ir Tzion, Ir is city of Zion. Timaleh, please fill with us. What should it be filled with? The Jewish people. That's us. Baruch Hashem. We're filling up the city. We still haven't built the Mikdash though. Yibaneh Mikdash, may the temple be rebuilt, and may the city be filled. And then, there, we will sing a new song. And we'll fill as we go up to the Temple Mount. Enjoy. Okay, ready from the top? We'll do it slowly in the Hebrew. Yibaneh, Yibaneh, Yibaneh HaMikdash, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion Temaleh. Again, Yibaneh, Yibaneh, Yibaneh HaMikdash, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion, Ir Tzion Temaleh. ושם נשיר שיר חדש, עובר נעלה. ושם נשיר שיר חדש, עובר נעלה. לי 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 It's a good song to sing on Asara B'Tevet. 2 days ago, right? We commemorated the beginning of the destruction of Jerusalem. So we pray for Jerusalem to be rebuilt once again. Yafeh. Okay. Let's open up our books about the laws of Shabbat one more time. Perfect. Thank you so much. I actually have one here already. You can have that. I have this one. I have one. Thank you. Okay, questions? We did Bishul, we did Borer yesterday. We're moving right along to the next chapter about food preparations. This is going to be covering a lot of different issues that you have to be aware of, other than the two biggies we mentioned. Shabbat Echad, yes. Yes. Page 231. One of the prohibitions of Shabbat is called tochen. Tochen means grinding. Grinding. They would take some kernels of wheat and you grind them into flour. We still do that till today. This is part of the process of baking bread. It's part of what's called creative work. So we're not allowed to grind on Shabbat. So if you have some almonds and you want to grind them up, not on Shabbat. If you have some nuts, not on Shabbat. This is why Pinchas the other day asked me, what do we define as grinding? You take something big pieces, big chunks, and you make them into very small pieces. That's what grinding does, right? So the question is, can I cut a salad? I take a big cucumber and I cut it up into tiny little pieces of cucumber. Take a look on page 233. 233. The Rishonim disagree. Micha, will you read for us, please?
Chopping vegetables and mashing bananas and avocados. The Rishonim disagree whether the prohibition of kohen applies to chopping vegetables finely for salad. Some maintain that since cutting the vegetables into small pieces serves a purpose, the prohibition applies. However, according to the majority of the Rishonim, this is prohibited only if the vegetables are otherwise inedible, such as when one chops vegetables in order to cook them. In contrast, if the vegetables are edible raw, there is no problem with chopping them. In practice, since this disagreement concerns a Torah law, one should defer to the stringent opinion. Thus, one may not cut vegetables finely for a salad. However, if the salad is being prepared right before the meal, even the stringent opinion permits it. In this case, the cutting is not derech melacha, but derech achila, as one may eat finely cut food on Shabbat. La chatila, it is preferable, even when preparing salad for the upcoming meal, not to cut the pieces especially finely.
Okay, that's what we said before, that I remember yesterday we were speaking about borer. We spoke about separating the bad from the good. It's a big problem. We said sometimes we allow it if it's immediately before eating, or even while you're during the eating. When you're eating fish, you need to separate out the bones. That can be allowed. Why? Because it's called derech achila. The manner in which you're doing the activity it's part of your eating process. It's not derech melacha, the manner of work. So we find the same terms here when it comes to cutting a salad. If you're working in a kitchen, in a restaurant, the beginning of the day, you cut, chop, at a falafel stand, they cut a massive amount of vegetables, and then they use it throughout the whole day. Right? They put it in a container, they put it in the fridge, hopefully, and then they use it. So that would be derech melacha. That's the manner of, doing work, industrialized grinding, essentially. Even though you're using a knife, you're cutting big chunks into small ones. But if you're just cutting yourself a salad right before you eat the salad, it's considered to be part of preparing the food for you to eat, and it can be allowed. The best advice is to cut your pieces of salad for Shabbat, on Shabbat, a little bit larger than usual. During the week, you might cut them very, very fine, and on Shabbat, you cut them a little bit larger. That makes it less similar to the malacha of tochen. If you have on your shoe some mud, after it rains, right, you walk, and there's mud on the ground. Sometimes you get a chunk of mud, and it dries, and it gets hard. And what happens when you remove it? When you pick at it, it crumbles into tiny little pieces, right? Mm-hmm. The mud, the cake of mud, crumbles into tiny pieces. This is a problem of tochen, of grinding. You're taking something that's earth in one chunk, and you're dividing it into tiny little chunks. It's a problem. We should try to not to do that. Only take off the mud when it's still wet, when it's still moist. It won't crumble into tiny little pieces. You might be able to do it, if necessary, not in the normal way. Use the back of your hand with one shoe to use the other to take off the mud. Now, what about? There's an interesting surprising ramification of that. What's the first ritual of Shabbat? You make kiddush, and then what do? You wash your hands, and then what do? You take the challah, and we want them to be whole, right? We don't have sliced challah. Why not sliced? It's a mitzvah to make the bracha on a whole challah. A whole represents blessing, it represents completeness. It's more respectable to have a whole bread than a tiny little slice of bread. So that's why when we make the bracha on the chalot for Shabbat, we want them to be whole. It's supposed to actually have 2 whole chalot. What do we do after we make the bracha? We have to eat them. So we have to divide it. We have to slice it up. How can you slice up a challah? Isn't that taking something big and making tiny little pieces of it? Take a look.
But you can do it with your hands.
You can do it with your hands. It doesn't matter though.
It's a custom.
There is a custom to do it with your hands. If you look on page 234, obviously the slices are not very thin usually, and you have to take into consideration here that this is not an agricultural process of grinding kernels into flour. We're cutting bigger things into smaller pieces. If it's not with a utensil designed for the purpose, you're not using a grater, then we say it's allowed. My father, I think, had a tradition from his family that he would not cut the pieces of the challah straight. He'd cut on an angle. He always cut on an angle. Could be connected to this stringency, to not be cutting to so fine, and you're allowed to slice the meat, cheese, the eggs, and of course the meat, cheese, and eggs are not organic, grown from the earth. It's it's not the same thing as a kernel of wheat. Also the bread, it's already been ground, right, and then reconstituted into dough. Right, it comes from flour, which was made from kernels, which was ground. So it's already ground up and then reconstituted. It's not the same as taking the original vegetable or grain and grinding it up. Okay, another malacha is called lash, making dough. You're not allowed to make dough on Shabbat. Here is the big question about people. You guys are not so Israeli yet. What do Israelis like to have on their bread?
Hummus.
Yes.
What's the problem with making hummus?
You
How do you make hummus?
you
Where does
chop-
hummus come from?
From the hummus.
Comes from hummus.
How it's called? the
Chickpeas. they're called.
Yes.
Chickpeas. You take chickpeas, you boil them up, you cook them, and then you grind them. You grind them. Usually nowadays we use a blender.
Okay.
You grind them and mash them. You can't do that on Shabbat. Definitely not. What about tahina? What is tahina?
Yeah, you mix sesame with water.
It comes from sesames, and then they grind up the sesames, and it becomes a thick paste. Usually you buy in the store a container of thick paste. You can't really eat it that way. It's too thick. It's too concentrated. The stuff that you get on top of your falafel, it's very loose and watery, right? How do they do that? They take the thick paste, and they mix it with water and oil and spices, salt and lemon juice and garlic, all sorts of. That's what makes the tahina yummy. All those spices. But so if you want to make tahina on Shabbat, the problem is you're making this paste. You're taking water and adding it to this mixture, and you're mixing it up, and essentially making it's like a dough. It's like a dough. Making a dough is one of the 39 categories. Kneading, lash is called kneading. Kneading a dough is prohibited on Shabbat. Many rabbis say you're not allowed to prepare tahina on Shabbat. You must prepare it from before Shabbat. If you prepare it from before Shabbat, make it, do the mixing, do the mashing and the mixing and the everything before Shabbat and put it in the refrigerator. That's fine. Some people like to make it fresh. There are some rabbis who say there's room to be lenient because what happens at the end result of tahina usually is not a thick paste. It's not a dough-like material. It's a liquid. It's a very thin liquid. Thin liquid is not dough. You're not kneading it. The problem is that in the process, the way it works, you just try it once at home. When you're making tahina, at first it gets thick and only then gets thin. It's interesting. It starts off, you have the liquid, water, so it's very watery. But then when you start to mix it with the paste, it gets very thick. And then the more you mix it, it gets thin again. So we have this complicated process. Some rabbis say don't do that on Shabbat. Other rabbis say if you do it not in the normal way, and the end result is that it's going to be a very loose mixture, you can still do it on Shabbat and prepare tahina
When you do
on
it
Shabbat.
several hours before beginning of the Shabbat, let's say as you see it at 12 o'clock, it's still fresh when the Shabbat is beginning.
That's best. That's best. But that doesn't help you for Shabbat morning. And doesn't help you for Shabbat afternoon. So the question is, if you're going to make tahina on Shabbat afternoon, because you want it to be fresh and tasty, you really have to change up. Let's see what he says inside here. He gives you the instructions here. He says, in practice, in times of great need, one may rely on those who are lenient. Let's see where he talks about tahina explicitly. At the top of page 238, it says in the second paragraph on the top of page 238, according to this, water may be added, it's chapter 12, section 4, water may be added to raw tahina, since that makes it more liquid. However, some prohibit doing so, since during the process, there is a stage in which the mixture becomes a bit harder. Nevertheless, halacha and practice follows those who are lenient, since the eventual result is a loose mixture. Additionally, since the sesame seeds in the tahina were ground and mixed before Shabbat, according to many, the prohibition of lash no longer applies. In order to avoid any doubt, it is proper to mix with a shinui. Shinui is a change of the regular way. So if you're going to usually mix it with a fork, this time mix it with the back of the fork. If you would usually mix it with a spoon, use the back of the spoon. Do it if you're usually going to mix it round and round and round, this time do X, across, up and down, right and left. Don't do the normal way of mixing to avoid any type of prohibition of lash on Shabbat, of mixing a dough. Okay? Question. Somebody wanted to ask a question.
Okay.
Yes.
My mother never prepared food on Shabbat.
Excellent. Good.
Everything before.
Well, if you do everything beforehand, nowadays, with the refrigeration that we have, it's so convenient. Everybody in their houses has a refrigerator. Why not? Shabbat is for rest. But in the ancient times, it was more difficult to have fresh food. The other hand is you want to have delicious, fresh food for Shabbat. It's supposed to delight, oneg Shabbat. You're supposed to delight on the Shabbat. And so there's this tension. But you're absolutely right. Nowadays, more and more, The more you do before Shabbat, the better. The better. You won't have any issues of, is it, this prohibition or that prohibition of work with the various materials in the kitchen. It's a good idea.
Well, it's funny what the Rav said about this Techina, because remember, I think 2 weeks ago, I went to a family, they always have this nice Techina, but this time on the table I watch and say, hey, it's this stick based.
Thick,
So I was like, the Techina finished, he said, yeah, I had no time to mix it. So I was like, why don't mix it now?
There you go.
But I didn't know
Now
about
you
this
know.
rule. That's
They
why
were worried. They were worried about mixing it. They were stringent. Some people are more lenient. Some people are more stringent. You follow your rabbi, and it's fine. Okay. Another issue when you're preparing food, this you guys should be aware. It's very interesting. Regarding squeezing out foods is usually a problem. Look at page 243. 243. Squeezing fruits. Josh, can you read for us squeezing fruits on page 243? That's section 8 of chapter 12.
Juicing, that is, squeezing fruits in order to release their juice, is a violation of the prohibition of Netherek, the Tol Ada of the Melacha Dash. Dash involves separating wheat kernels from the husk. Mefarek involves separating juice from its fruit. It's prohibited by Torah law to squeeze olives to produce oil or to squeeze grapes to produce wine. Wine and oil are imported liquids. And the majority of olives and grapes are grown in order to produce these liquids. In contrast, the prohibition of juicing other fruits which are not grown primarily for their juice is rabbinic.
But it's still forbidden. It's rabbinic, but it's still forbidden. So taking a lemon and squeezing it into your tea is prohibited on Shabbat. Making lemonade on Shabbat is prohibited. The squeezing part. Take a look. There's a way that you could do it. There's a fascinating halacha. The rabbis were aware and they said, well, first of all, we're dealing with a rabbinic prohibition because it's not olives or grapes. Not everybody squeezes lemons for their juice. Sometimes they're added to the food as it is. And it's not primarily grown for squeezing. So take a look at...
Can you squeeze? Like if you have salmon, can you squeeze on your salmon?
If it's not organic, if it's not grown from the ground, there's room to be lenient. But we're talking about fruit now. Fruit.
Lemon is fruit.
Lemon is a fruit. It's a problem. So he says here, the following halacha, the rabbis reached the following conclusion. They said, some fruit, if it's not normally squeezed for its juice, or it's not meant for its juice, like you said, salmon. People eat salmon. Some people like to squeeze it out and eat the salmon without the juice, or whatever it is. Some people like their food more dry.
Squeeze the lemon on the
You squeeze the lemon on that's something else. But some people like to eat the food more dry and they squeeze it out. So the rabbi said as follows. If what you're doing looks very much like making juice, you take a fruit and you hold it on top of a bowl and you squeeze it, and what you get in the bowl is juice. You shouldn't be doing that on Shabbat. What's the normal way of making lemonade? You take a lemon, you squeeze it onto a bowl or a pitcher, and then the juice comes in. And then you add some water, you add some sugar, whatever it is. So that's prohibited on Shabbat. That's too much like squeezing out the juice from a fruit. Juicing, that's one of the 39 categories of work. It's separating out separating the kernels from the husk of the wheat. So you're not allowed to squeeze the fruit. But what happens if you take lemon and you don't hold it on top of a bowl that's empty in order to collect the juice? You hold it on top of a piece of fish, or you hold it on top of a salad where there's lettuce and other vegetables. So then the juice never really becomes juice by itself. It's not an independent entity of juice. So you're not really separating juice from a fruit. You're separating food from food. Yeah, the lemon drops, the drops of the lemon juice automatically get absorbed in the food that's underneath it. And so that's allowed. So you're allowed to do that. So this is what he says over here. Take a look.
But if you
Yeah.
put the juice in a cup and you use another cup and another cup, you can still use it with water, like with hot water?
No. That's the laws of cooking. That's about how far you are from the heat source. That's why we get into one cup and another cup and another cup. But this has nothing to do with heat. This has nothing to do with sources. This is just the activity of squeezing the juice. Is it called juicing? So if it produces juice, independent of anything else, then it's a problem. But if you squeeze it onto food, then it's allowed. Not onto liquid. You cannot squeeze your lemon into tea on Shabbat. You can cut up the lemon and put the lemon in the tea if it's not going to cook it. We talked about cooking the other day. If it's in the third vessel, maybe you can rely on that. But you should not be squeezing lemon into your tea. You can squeeze lemon onto your food, onto your salad, onto your fish, but not onto an empty vessel or a vessel that has liquid in it. Okay, it's a little bit of a fine point. Yeah.
Maybe strange question, because now I think about, okay, no tahina mixing with water, no juice making. Can you make like lemonade? You know, when you mix the syrup with the water, can you make it?
With syrup?
Yes.
Yeah, because there's no problem. It's not a thick paste, right? And you're not squeezing out any fruit. The fruit has already been squeezed from before Shabbat. You're just mixing together. You're allowed to make mixtures as long as it doesn't create a paste, a thick paste. That's what we talked about before, the problem of lash. Now we're learning it. Then we talked about tochen, lash, and now mefarek. Mefarek is this squeezing, the problem of squeezing. By the way, that's one of the reasons that there's another problem of squeezing liquids out of solids. We spoke about it the other day, and that has to do with laundering. It's another one of the melachot is to do your laundry, to clean clothes, because part of the processing of the textiles was to clean the wool. You put in soap, you put in water, it gets clean. You're not allowed to launder your clothes on Shabbat. You cannot clean them. And part of the process of laundering is squeezing the liquid out of the textile. So you cannot squeeze water out of material. That's why you're not allowed to use a sponge to wash your dishes on Shabbat. Because you'll be squeezing the water out of the sponge. There are special sponges you can buy, which are built differently, very thinly spaced. The water doesn't really get absorbed within them. And so you're allowed to use them on Shabbat. But almost all the sponges are not allowed to be used on Shabbat. If you want to wash your dishes, you have to be very careful. We mentioned it earlier. First of all, with the hot water, make sure you're not using hot water that's going to cause other water to get heated up. And you make sure you don't use a sponge, which is prohibited on Shabbat. Okay, so there's many, many laws of Shabbat. We're trying to briefly giving you the most important, most practical tips that you have to be careful about. And a more thorough discussion appears in the books. You can, of course, study them in greater depth on your own time. Bezrat Hashem will continue with chapter 12, some more details about preparing, things you have to be aware about when you're preparing food on Shabbat. Of course, Eitan takes the high road, and Ravid, they're very experienced. They say, just prepare everything before Shabbat. You won't have to get into any trouble on Shabbat itself. It's always good to be prepared. I want to wish you all Shabbat Shalom.
You don't have the chance to make mistakes.
That's it. But you're playing with fire, man. You like to live on the edge. I like it. Okay, Shabbat Shalom to one and all. Speak to you.
I have one question.
Yeah.
If you load the dishwasher before Shabbat and you put them on before Shabbat, can you unload them on Shabbat?
It's a good question. It's a good question. Ask me next week. I want to discuss it in greater detail.